Well, I think different approaches have to be taken for different types of support. One, we're launching the Global Trade Liquidity Program today with Pascal, which is to try to achieve some $50 billion through a combination of IFC investment, African Development Bank, public agencies, but then to mobilize additional resources for commercial banks. And so that I just think we need to execute, but there's a good possibility that we'll be able to deliver those sums. A second approach for those of us with development institutions is that I think with the work that we've been doing with the WTO, the regional development banks, that we've vastly upgraded the amount of assistance that we're providing aid for trade. And so again, it's a question of working with clients to deliver, because if it's either grants or loans, it has to be the client's decision. But as we show the interest, I think we can follow through. And then third, for some of the support from different governments, we just have to keep making the cases we are for development assistance generally about the criticality of not pulling back in the midst of this economic crisis.
And the next steps? Where do we go from here?
Well, first, I think you heard some very interesting points today and some good papers presenting different ideas. So the emphasis has to be on execution. We now have to deliver. But I guess the steps that I hope we could go beyond that would be threefold. One, great opportunities to draw in the private sector. When I talk to logistics firms, express firms, I think they would like to try to work with us, and they have a tremendous amount of knowledge, technology, other things to apply, and especially with some of the poorer countries where I think they're interested in trying to be of support. A second is a point that Donald Cabaruca made, Luis Alberto Moreno made. I think there's some great potential for regional integration projects that would be of additional support. And third, I think we now need to also heighten our focus on results and understand whether we're being effective or not, so that we can continue to fine-tune. So I think those would be three topics that we should focus on over the next year.
Bob Zoellick, many thanks.
My pleasure.
Mr. Cabaruca, this meeting here has been discussing aid for trade. What are the next steps in this initiative?
I think there are two critical next steps. One is monitoring, implementation. Number two is picking out best practices so far to be able to scale them up. These two are extremely important because I've learned many lessons over the last 2 years. I think we should leverage them now by careful monitoring, picking them up, so that you operate over a narrow area, which gives us greater effectiveness. Now, for me, I am putting emphasis on trying to overcome the impediments, either policy or otherwise, to regional integration. Because there is a disconnect between what we want to do and what the resources available are meant to do. This is why I mentioned the issue of free riding in regional programs, which we have to address.
And how can we assure that these aid for trade funds continue to flow even in this time of economic crisis?
I think that this is a time when aid for trade flows should flow even more. You know, over the recent few months, there have been a lot of controversial writings on the whole issue of aid. But I think aid for trade stands out as a kind of aid which you should be emphasizing at this time. Because the crisis will end sooner or later, maybe in a year and a half. The economy of the world will pick up, I hope so. And it is critical that the low-income countries are able to participate in the recovery much better than they have done in the past. And so the aid for trade, for me, is part of the entire recovery process for the low-income countries. And I hope the donors can provide additional and new funding for this program.
Mr. Gurria, you've just produced with the WTO an important report on aid for trade. Could you give us an idea of some of the trends that we've seen over the past couple of years since the last report?
Substantially positive. First of all, we had 90 recipient countries, the partner countries, respond to the questionnaire rather than 7 2 years ago. So this basically covers substantially all of the developing countries that are of relevance. And we have about 57 of the donor governments and institutions instead of 43. So that's in terms of the cover. Second, in terms of the flows, we are up 10% from last year, but we're also up to $25 billion. We've narrowed the definition. In the beginning, when we said aid for trade, all the aid was characterized as aid for trade. Obviously, this was not very serious. It was not practically possible. We've now narrowed the definition so we can identify more clearly what is aid for trade and what is not. 25 billion, it's a very, very important figure. It's about roughly 22 to 25% of the total flows of aid. It's growing. It has captured the imagination of many of the donor countries. It is increasingly useful, and it is increasingly partner-led. That is, it is the recipient countries saying what for, where do you apply it, what bottlenecks they are perceiving that are important. And it's also being used to do institutional development, which is very important.
So the program seems to be working well, but how can we assure that in this time of economic crisis that these funds continue to flow?
That is a very great challenge. Our calculations so far, the numbers show we have not had a reduction in aid flows. There has been a pledge by the leaders. We asked them at the OECD and then at the G20 and in other fora where they say we will maintain our commitments. But unfortunately, that may not be enough, because the crisis is now making these countries more vulnerable and they are needing more resources. You have falling commodity prices, volume reductions that are very important because there's less demand, falling remittances because many of their co-nationals that are outside there in the developed countries working are losing their jobs and they're not able to send the remittances. And we also have less financial flows, with the credit crunch is affecting them very severely, and less investment flows. So you have more needs. So even keeping the original commitments for the MDGs or Gleneagles may not be enough. We may need to increase these amounts. But again, you're looking at an instrument which is working, which is successful so far, and which is working not only in terms of consumption patterns, but basically really breaking a lot of the bottlenecks that are necessary for the efforts of these very poor countries in the world, and particularly focusing on Africa right now, for them to be able to take their produce to the markets.
Mr. Strauss-Kahn, two questions for you, sir. First, how can we ensure that aid for trade contributions continue to flow during this time of economic crisis?
Aid for trade is absolutely critical to get out from the crisis, especially for developing countries, and for the capacity to take advantage of recovery when recovery will take place. Of course, the first thing which is cut when you have a crisis like this one is a different kind of aid, and that's what we see all around the world, and especially aid for trade. So I think very significant that all the head of the multilateral agencies and the regional banks are here surrounding Pascal Lamy and trying to boost aid for trade. We all believe that it's absolutely critical that this program goes on. It includes technical assistance. It includes what we all do on the field, but it includes also a lot of things about the flows, the financial flows themselves, and trade finance. So all that is needed not only for help to recovery and to be part of the recovery, but also to allow countries, and especially developing countries, to take advantage of the recovery in, let's say, 8 months, 1 year from now.
And what are the next steps in the Aid for Trade initiative?
Well, depends on which agency you're talking about. The IMF, for instance, is not a developing agency. So what we do is technical assistance on custom systems, things like that. But what we also do is to try to provide countries with support and balance of payment when countries have balance of payment needs. And we have boosted a lot the different facility we have. increasing the access level for different countries, tripling the resources that we may make available, developing concessional lending. So next step are probably just to implement all what has been decided during the last G20 in London, for instance, and probably will be also complemented with the G20 where will take place in Pittsburgh just after the summer. A lot of things has been announced, decided, now we need just to make it, to do it.